I grew up playing the basketball with the boys, so like it's always been physical and feisty, and like that's what it is, and you got to find a way to hold your.
She went down grabbing her leg, and the arena went quiet in the specific way that only happens when the crowd understands immediately that what they are watching is not ordinary contact. This was not the first time this season. It was the fourth lower body breakdown in under 2 months for the player whose healthy presence is the single most commercially significant variable in the entire WNBA right now. The Fever's response was the same response they have given every single time, day to day, progressing well, monitor her status. Language so consistently vague that it stopped functioning as medical communication and started functioning as a brand management tool. Caitlin Clark went down, the arena froze, and the organization that built its commercial future around her body issued a statement calibrated to keep sponsors calm rather than to accurately describe what was happening to a human being on their payroll. The fans who packed that building, who paid secondary market prices specifically to watch her play, received the same careful ambiguity they had been receiving since the first quad issue arrived in the early weeks of the season. At some point, the pattern stops being bad luck and starts being a systemic failure. And 4 breakdowns in 8 weeks is well past the point where that conversation becomes unavoidable. Sophie Cunningham is the player who brought the physical identity this roster needed, and her presence beside Clark is the specific competitive dynamic that has changed how opponents approach every defensive possession. She does not back down from anyone, and the footage of her standing her ground against players twice her commercial profile, while the officials manage the environment inconsistently around her, has become the defining visual of the Fever's competitive character this season. Her willingness to absorb contact and respond without flinching sent a message to the rest of the roster that the standard for competitive toughness was being set from the perimeter rather than from the more obvious sources that most teams rely on. When Clark went down, and the team needed someone to hold the emotional center of the locker room together, Cunningham's competitive identity was exactly the infrastructure that made it possible for the Fever to function as a coherent competitive unit, rather than collapsing around the absence of their commercial anchor. That contribution does not show up in box scores, and it does not generate the same sponsorship conversations that Clark's logo threes produce. But it is the specific quality that separates teams that fall apart under adversity from teams that find out who they actually are when the adversity arrives. The WNBA has a player in Sophie Cunningham who is doing exactly what veteran players are supposed to do, and the conversation around the Fever's culture would benefit from spending significantly more time on that reality. Lexie Hull went down with an eye injury that produced visible blood and generated the specific kind of alarmed silence from the crowd that only arrives when the contact looks genuinely serious rather than merely painful. The questions that followed about return-to-play protocols, whether the medical evaluation was sufficient, whether she was cleared too quickly, whether the standard applied to her situation matched the standard a player deserves, are legitimate professional questions that any reporter covering player safety should be asking. Professional athletes get hurt, and professional leagues have established protocols specifically to protect them from returning before their bodies are ready. Those protocols exist because teams have historically been incentivized to return players faster than medical consensus recommends. When an injury involves the eye and the head and there is visible trauma, and a player returns before the crowd has fully processed what they witnessed, the protocol question is not alarmist. It is the normal and necessary scrutiny that player safety coverage requires. The WNBA communication around that situation was consistent with their communication around Clark's recurring injuries and around every other player health situation this season, vague, carefully worded, and oriented toward minimizing alarm rather than maximizing transparency. The fans asking whether the league takes its players' bodies seriously are not being unreasonable. They are reading the communication pattern accurately and drawing the conclusion that the communication pattern was designed to produce, which is exactly the opposite of what the league needs from an audience it is actively trying to grow. The player protection conversation has been running all season, and it keeps returning to the same structural gap. The WNBA medical and operational infrastructure was built for a smaller, less visible league and has not been modernized to match the commercial scale the sport currently occupies. Travel conditions, recovery windows, back-to-back scheduling. The load placed on star players who carry both competitive and promotional responsibilities simultaneously. None of those elements have been redesigned around the commercial reality that one player's arrival created almost overnight. She's being asked to carry the weight of a league's growth narrative while traveling, promoting, competing, and recovering on infrastructure that was not designed to support that weight. And the recurring injury pattern is the body's honest accounting of the gap between what is being demanded and what the support structure is providing. The league has a genuine and documented opportunity to use this moment as the catalyst for modernization, better medical transparency, and forced recovery standards. Travel conditions that match the commercial scale of a league signing multi-billion-dollar broadcast deals. Every week that passes without that conversation producing visible structural outcomes is another week the injury pattern continues generating the kind of fan frustration that the league's commercial partners are watching alongside everyone else. The new broadcast deal and the attendance growth are real achievements, and the gap between what the league is asking its players to produce to sustain those achievements and what it is investing in the support structures required to sustain production at that level is the central contradiction the sport has to resolve. The officiating situation and the injury situation are not separate stories. They are two expressions of the same underlying reality about how the league is managing its most valuable players. Physical targeting that goes uncalled places additional stress on bodies that are already operating under inadequate recovery conditions. Every hard foul that is permitted without consequence adds to the cumulative load the player absorbs across a season. The technical foul for bench clapping, the Carter hip check that required retroactive upgrade, the elbow to Clark's chest that produced a foul call in the wrong direction. Each incident is individually notable and collectively, they describe an officiating environment that has not been calibrated to protect the players most at risk of serious injury from repeated unaddressed contact. Cunningham's sideline fire and vocal advocacy for her teammate is the emotional response that the coaching staff has not produced from the head coach position. And the fact that veteran leadership on the court is filling a role that institutional advocacy should be filling is the accountability question that the Fever's front office has consistently avoided answering. The league cannot simultaneously build its commercial future around the health and continued extraordinary performance of one specific player and maintain an officiating environment that allows physical targeting of that player without adequate and immediate consequence. Those two organizational positions are incompatible, and the season's injury report is the most concrete available evidence of what incompatible positions produce when neither one gives way. The broader story here is not about individual incidents or individual players. It is about an institutional moment where the gap between what the WNBA presents itself as and what it actually is for the players inside, it has become too visible to manage through communication alone. Every fan who bought a ticket to see Clark play and watched the Fever issue a day-to-day statement, while the empty seat beside them told a different story, is now carrying a specific impression of how this organization operates when commercial interests and player welfare come into conflict. Every new viewer who found women's basketball through her presence and is now watching the injury cycle repeat while the communication remains deliberately vague is forming a first impression of the WNBA that no marketing campaign can efficiently override once formed. The commercial opportunity the league currently occupies is historically significant. The attendance numbers, the broadcast deals, the merchandise revenue. The mainstream cultural attention, all of it is available in a way that it was not before her arrival and will not be at this scale indefinitely. Using that window to modernize the infrastructure rather than simply extracting from the current commercial moment is the decision that separates organizations that build lasting institutions from organizations that benefit temporarily from circumstances they did not create and cannot sustain. The players at the center of this season's story, the ones getting injured, the ones absorbing targeting, the ones filling comment sections with their specific and documented frustrations, are not asking for celebrity treatment. They are asking for professional standards, and the distance between those two things is exactly the distance the league has to close before the window closes with it.